All right. Lesson 10, principal match questions. You're nearing the home stretch. The last two question types we will cover are principal match and parallel the reasoning. We've already covered questions that ask you to find a principle that strengthens, confirms, or is consistent with the argument's methods. The analysis you need to do will be similar to the expect. While many principal questions are reasonable, some can get nasty, and it's hard to tell which is which until you're in the middle of them. Therefore, you might consider holding off on principal match questions until you've worked most other types. Let's look at how it works. Statistics indicating, here's our argument. Let's read the question first. The argumentation conforms most closely with which of the following principles? All right, so conforms most closely to which of the following principal match? Statistics indicating a sudden increase in the incidence of a problem often merely reflect a heightened awareness of the problem or a greater ability to record its occurrence. Hence, we should be wary of proposals for radical solutions to problems when those proposals are a reaction to new statistical data. So, the argument conforms most closely with which of the following principles? Let's read our answer choices. A better cognizance of a problem does not warrant the undertaking of a radical solution to the problem. No. Attempts to stop the occurrence of a problem should be preceded by a determination that the problem actually exists. That doesn't make any sense. A and B are out. Proposals for radical solutions to problems should be based on statistical data alone. No. Statistical data should not be manipulated to make a radical solution to a problem seem more justified than it actually is. This one sounds the best. Radical solutions to problems can cause other problems and end up doing more harm than good. That's not the same principle. I'm going to go with D. Here's how to crack it. First, as always, you have to identify your task. Here it is again. The argumentation conforms most closely with which of the following principles. You are asked to find a principle among the answers with which the argument would be consistent. The choices will be generally worded statements like, oh, a moral to a story that could apply to multiple situations. And what you need to do is pick the one with the argument conforms or fits. If this reminds you of how you work a reasoning question, then you're on the right track. Step 2, analyze the argument. You need to have a clear understanding of what's happening in the argument. Not all principal match questions will be true. That is the case, but be sure to paraphrase the situation. Since the argument has a conclusion and premise, start by noting them. Author's conclusion. We should be wary of proposals for radical solutions to problems when those proposals are a reaction to new statistical data. Author's premises. Statistics that indicate increased incidence of problems may actually reflect increased awareness of the problem or increased ability to measure it. Step 3, act. Because you're going to be asked to identify the principle what the argument would be fits best, you should be able to state in basic terms what's going on here. For this example, you might come up with something like greater awareness or better measurements alone are not good reason for radical solutions. As you evaluate the answer choices, match the general descriptions in the answers to specifics in the argument. Cross off any that are not consistent. A better cognizance of a problem does not warrant the undertaking of a radical solution to the problem. This sounds like a pretty close match to what you are looking for. It says that the statistics may reflect greater awareness of a problem rather than an actual increase in its incidence. Thus, taking a radical action might not be warranted. Hold on to it. Attempts to stop the occurrence of a problem should be preceded by the determination. This does not match the argument. Radical solutions are not necessarily the same as stopping a problem. In addition, the author accepts the problems exist, but questions whether their apparent increase in frequency is real. Get rid of it. Proposals for radical solutions to problems should be based on statistical data alone. Be sure to read this one carefully. It says that radical solutions should be based on data alone. This goes against your paraphrase in the author's suggestion. Statistical data should not be manipulated just to make a radical solution to a problem seem more justified. The statement may seem reasonable, doesn't match the argument. While the author might even and may be true, or at least seem reasonable, but doesn't match the argument or even your paraphrase. Eliminate it. Now you're left with A, the correct answer. Notice your paraphrase. This question illustrates how there can be a pretty big difference between a principal match question that asks questions. Of course, the answer on both will go along conclusion. A principal argument conforms must also match the argument's method. So to find an answer choice that would conform to a principle contained in the argument. Your approach should state, in this case, paraphrase the principle, and then find the answer choice that matches one. Let's read the question. Which of the following judgments stated above? All right, so that's one. Etiquette firmly opposes both obscene and malicious talk, but this does not imply that speech needs to be restricted by law. Etiquette does not necessarily even oppose the expression of offensive. Rather, it dictates that offensive, disturbing, or controversial ideas is appropriate and that where a discussion of such ideas is to be done in a civil manner. So read the question again. Which of the following judgments most closely corresponds to the principles of etiquette stated above? Neighbors should not be gruff or unfriendly to one another when they meet on the street. When prosecutors elicit testimony from a cooperative witness, they should do so without intensive questioning. No. There should be restrictions on speech only if a large majority of the population finds the speech offensive and hateful. No. The journalist at a news conference should not ask a politician potentially embarrassing questions about a controversial policy issue. The moderator of a panel of discussion of a divisive moral issue should not allow participants to engage in name-calling. So reading all of those answers, none of them jump out, but if we're looking at the question, most closely corresponds to the principles of etiquette stated above, and we can say that etiquette firmly opposes both obscene and malicious talk, but this does not imply that speech needs to be restricted by law. Basically, the idea is that etiquette is etiquette is important, have their day in the sun. So is corresponding to this. Along the same line. So there should be restrictions on speech. It says nothing about a population. Name calling isn't useful. I'm not going to go with this one. Only if it's large. I'm going to say D again. First, as response to the principles of etiquette stated above. You are asked to find a situation among the answers that is consistent with the general rule in the argument. This time the choices will be specific situations, and you need to pick the one that fits most accurately and completely with the principle in the argument. Analyze the argument. Again, you need to have a clear understanding of what's happening in the argument. This one does not have a clear conclusion and premise, so just by starting reading the rule carefully. First, you are told that etiquette opposes obscene and malicious talk, but not the expression of offensive ideas as long as they're discussed when appropriate and in a civil, polite manner. You need to identify the situation in the answers that best matches the arguments. To start with the paraphrase of the principle. Etiquette allows for polite discussion even if the topic is being controversial. All right. As you evaluate the answer choices, match the specific descriptions in the answers to the general rule in the argument. Cross off any that are not consistent with your paraphrase or that don't match the principle presented in the argument. Neighbors should not be gruff or unfriendly to one another. Does this match your paraphrase? No, get rid of it. When prosecutors elicit testimony from a cooperative witness, they should do so without intensive questioning. This does not match the argument. This addresses being polite, but not politely controversial. Cross it off. There should be restrictions on speech only. So the only reason for restricting speech is that the majority finds offensive. The principle is about how to discuss offensive material, not when to restrict it. This one has to go. The journalist, so this is an almost, and I put it up again. The journalist at news conferences should not ask a politician potentially embarrassing questions about a controversial policy issue. This almost matches, but it is about being polite, not embarrassing a politician, not about how to discuss controversial topics. Get rid of it. The moderator of a panel discussion of a device from our issue should not allow participants to engage in name calling. This sounds like a pretty close match to when you were looking for it. A moderator not allowing name calling during a discussion of a divisive issue lines up with the play. This is your best answer. You felt like it was trickier or involved more work. These can often be time-consuming questions, which is one of the reasons they are best saved for later. Your best approach is to have a solid paraphrase of the principle in the argument, and then to match each answer choice to your paraphrase carefully. Arguments technique, using process of elimination with principle questions. As we saw from these examples, you are looking for a principle among the answer choices that will make your task stays the same. Eliminate any answers that don't match up with the paraphrase. The important thing to remember, you're looking for an answer choice that matches the decision or action in the principle. The principle but will match all the match questions. The reasoning above most sample question paraphrasing. The reasoning above most closely conforms to which of the following principles? Which of the following examples conforms most closely to the principles given in the argument above? Act. Make sure you know which direction the argument flows. Are you being asked to find a principle that conforms or a situation that conforms to a principle? Once you're sure, look for an answer that most closely matches the general principle of the underlying argument. Questions for last, because you should probably avoid them until you've worked all the other questions you can tackle. These questions are not necessarily more difficult, but they are certainly more time-consuming on average than most other question types. Don't forget all the questions are worth 1 point each. Why spend more time for the same reward? The reason that these take so long is that you have to perform step 2, analyze the arguments rather than just one. Each answer choice is another argument. Many arguments attached to parallel the reasoning questions can be diagrammed in some fashion. Your job is to find the answer that match the reasoning, which means the argument and the credited response are not logically flawed. The other types ask you to parallel the flaw or error, which means the argument and the answer will contain the same reasoning, and cross off logically correct answers on a parallel the flaw. Let's do a diagrammable parallel the flaw first. Let's read the question first. The flawed pattern of reasoning in which of the following most closely parallels that in the political scientist argument? Here is the political scientist. Governments worthy of respect permit policies. No government worthy of respect leaves minorities unprotected. Thus, any government that protects minorities permits criticism of its policies. So, all governments worthy of respect allow their citizens, leaves minorities unprotected. Thus, any government that protects minorities permits criticism of its policies. So, the flawed pattern of reasoning in which one of the following most closely parallels that in the political scientist argument. Politicians are admirable if they put the interest of those they serve, sometimes ignore the nation as a whole deserve admiration, for they are putting the interest of those they serve above their own. All cool, dry climates are populated by large mammals. No ecosystem populated by large mammals have abundant and varied plant life. Thus, ecosystems that do not have cool, dry climate intellectual is especially active. First-person narratives reveal the thoughts of the narrator but conceal those of the other characters. Some third-person narratives reveal the motives of every character. Thus, books should be written in the third person. So going back, all governments worthy of minorities permits criticism of its policies. The flawed pattern of reasoning, which of the following here's how to crack it. You've read the question. Here it is again. The flawed pattern of reasoning in which of the following most closely parallels that in the following scientist argument. Okay, so it's parallel reasoning argument, and you know that you have to try to diagram the argument, if possible, and match that diagram against the diagrams for each of the answer choices. You also know the reasoning itself is bad because the question asks for the flawed pattern of reasoning. Looking for conclusions on patterns of reasoning. Here it is again. Political scientists. All governments worthy of respect allow their citizens to dissent from government, leaves minorities unprotected. Thus, any government that protects minorities permits criticisms of its own policies. This looks eminently diagrammable. When you see quantities like all or none, you can turn these statements into conditionals and to diagram them. Don't forget to note the conclusion and premises, and since you're looking for a flaw, the assumption. Author's conclusion. Any government that protects minorities. Author's assumption. If you have one, you must have the other. Here's what we have to get. So I think C is going to be correct. Their citizens to leave respect leaves minorities unprotected, A to C. So any government that protects minorities permits criticism of its priorities, C to B. Always, you have to do is eliminate any answer choice that doesn't exhibit the same flawed logic. The credit or the answer to a parallel reasoning question will be a new argument that matches the key features and structure. Now you're going to carry your diagram over and eliminate any constituents in favor of the nation as a whole deserve admiration, for they are putting the interest of those they serve above their own. Diagram. Politicians who put others in admirable, A to B. Politicians who put national interests above their own constituents are admirable, A to B again. This doesn't match the argument, so it isn't the answer. Cross it off. Jazz musicians can improvise, A to B, and jazz musicians can read music. Improvise, C to B. Bingo. This is the same type of flawed reasoning that above, since the argument fails to consider that some jazz musicians might be able to do one but not the other. Hold on to it. Ecosystems with cool, dry climates are populated by large mammals, A to B. No ecosystem populated by mammals have abundant and varied plant life. That's B to C. A place without a cool, dry climate has lots of plants. Negating A to C. This doesn't match the argument, so it isn't the answer. Cross it off. Some intellectuals are not socially active, and no intellectual. The first part. A to negated C for the middle, and C to B for the last sentence. This can be appealing. Close. And if you miss translating the middle as if one is an intellectual and one is not an athlete, you can fall for it. Get rid of this one. First-person narratives reveal the thoughts of the narrator but conceal those of the other characters. Some third-person narratives reveal the motives of every character. Thus, books that rely on making all the characters' motives apparent should be written in the third person. You have an A to B but negate C in the first sentence, and then a D, B, and C in the second sentence. The final sentence becomes B and C to D. It is not even close to the original content. It's out. This leaves you with B because it's the only one that matches the structure of the original. Nice job. You got the right answer simply by diagramming the statement in the argument and diagramming each of the answer choices until you found the one that matched the original diagram. However, you probably noticed that it took a long time to do this question. Many of these questions you might get only half. Therefore, be sure to save these for the end. All right, going again. this employs the reasoning most similar to that above by the argument employed by the argument above. All right. So a small car offers less protection in an accident than a large car does. But since a smaller car is more maneuverable, it is better. The idea is, the author's conclusion is that a small car, so an artist's best work is generally that done in time before the artist becomes very well known. When the artists are diverted from artistic creation by demands for public appearances, their artistic work suffers. So artists achieving great fame can diminish their artistic reputations. It is best to insist that it may cause the child some unhappiness to have it stay indoors when others are playing outside. The child can benefit from time by learning to enjoy books and becoming prepared for a lifelong learning. For this work, vehicles built of light materials are more practical than vehicles built of heavy materials. This is so because while lighter vehicles do not last as long as heavier, they are cheaper to replace. Sounds close. Although it is important to limit the amount of sugar and fat in one's diet, it would be a mistake to try to follow a diet totally lacking in fat and sugar. It is better to consume sugar and fat in moderation, for then the cravings that lead to uncontrolled binges will be prevented. A person who exercises vigorously every day has less body fat than the average person to draw upon in the event of a wasting illness. But one should still endeavor to exercise vigorously every day because doing so significantly decreases the chances of contracting a wasting illness. So going back, after reading all the other arguments, a small car offers less protection in an accident than a large car does. But since the smaller car is more maneuverable, it is better to drive a small car because then accidents will be less likely. I believe E is going to be the correct answer because a person who is maneuverable has less body fat than an average person. Yeah, so I'm going to say E. Read the first question. Which of the following arguments employs reasoning most similar to the employed by the argument above? This question is asking us to parallel the reasoning with no mention of any flaws. Read it carefully, keeping a sharp eye on some or most wording as the conditional statements. A small car offers less protection in an accident than a large car does, but since the small car is more maneuverable, to drive small should be less likely. This doesn't contain any conditional statements, but still has a clear argument structure that you can work with and map out. You are asked to match cars better because of accidents. Author's premises. Even though small cars offer less protection than large cars, they are more maneuverable. Summarize the argument in general terms to make it more easier. Advantage, maneuverability. That makes an artist's best work is generally that done in time before the artist becomes very well known. When an artist grows famous and are diverted from artistic creation by demands for public, their artistic work suffers. So artists achieving great fame can diminish their artistic reputation. Does this match your summary? There is no choice of a better option in this argument, so it doesn't match. Cross it off. It is best to insist that a child spend at least some time every day reading indoors. Even though it may cause a child some unhappiness to have to stay indoors when others are outside playing, the child can benefit from the time by learning to enjoy books and becoming prepared for lifelong learning. Does it match your summary? One option, read inside, is chosen over another, playing outside, because of disadvantage, unhappy. It is outweighed by a lifelong advantage, where in the advantage making this disadvantage a non-issue. It's not, get rid of it. For this work, vehicles built of lightweight materials are more practical than vehicles built of heavy materials. While lighter vehicles do not last as long as heavier materials, they are cheaper to replace. Now you have an option, lightweight materials, chosen over another, heavy materials, because the advantage, cheaper, outweighs the disadvantage, not last as long. It doesn't imply that the advantage of being cheaper to replace makes the disadvantage not lasting as long a non-issue, but the choice is the closest to the original so far, so keep it. Although it is important to limit the amount of sugar and fat in one's diet, it would be a mistake to try to follow a diet totally lacking in sugar and fat. It is better to consume sugar and fat in moderation for when the cravings that lead to the uncontrolled binges will be prevented. How well does this one hold up? Here, the choice is not between two entirely different options, each with the advantage or disadvantage. It is about limiting the only option presented to prevent one negative consequence. It doesn't match, so this one is out. A person who exercises vigorously every day has less body fat than an average person to draw upon in the event of a wasting illness. But one should still endeavor to vigorously exercise every day because doing so significantly decreases the chances of contracting a wasting illness. So far, so good. Now compare C and E. Choice C arrives at the conclusion that lightweight vehicles are better not because they make a replacement a non-issue, that's still going to happen, but because they are cheaper to replace. The heavier vehicles are a better option if you want to avoid having to replace the vehicle. Both of the original argument E and endorse the options that reduce the likelihood of the disadvantage, while C does not. This makes E the credited response. Cool, we got the correct answer. Wow, good work. But notice again how long it took to map out each and every answer choice, which means you might want to skip this one altogether or save it for the very end. Notice also how similar the answers were. You can save a little time and headache by crossing out an answer as soon as you find a part that doesn't match. Arguments technique, using process of elimination with parallel to reasoning questions. It's pretty straightforward. If you are able to diagram the argument, then you must answer the choices and diagram those as well. Write it out, and then you've got proof that the choice either matches or doesn't match the argument. Sometimes you can't diagram parallel to reasoning questions. In these instances, try things that appear to be similar, and then we note a difference. Be it to the cause or another. Try to find an answer that can be summed up in the same way. Start by matching the up conclusions, then work backwards through the argument to match up each piece. If you find any part of the summary, cracking parallel to reasoning questions. Which of the following is not similar in reasoning to the argument above? The flawed pattern of reasoning exhibited by the argument above is most similar to that in which of the following? Parallel reasoning questions will either contain flawed or valid reasoning, and the question will tip you off. Try to diagram the argument and then diagram each of the answer choices, comparing each one of the diagram. Come up with the argument itself. If the argument is flawed, be careful not to choose an answer that fixes it. Save parallel to reasoning questions last. All right. That's it.